Okay. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I seek leave to take note of the report which was just tabled.
Is leave granted? Leave's granted. Senator Waters.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. It's with great pleasure that I speak to this report this afternoon. It's a very comprehensive report, and it's into the somewhat nonsensical notion that you can destroy invaluable and unique parts of Australia's environment and somehow just make a different version somewhere else, and that will make up for the damage that you've done. There's a very substantive report that was tabled, and whilst I'll make some remarks distancing the Greens from the recommendations in the report, I do wish to commend the substance of the report to this chamber. It's incredibly detailed, and I think it was a really comprehensive summary of some of the damning evidence that we received during the hearings. Now, we referred this issue to the Senate after a litany of examples where offsets were shown to be farcical and shown to be just simply a fig leaf for continued approval for almost every single application that ever passes the Environment Minister's desk. And some of the most affronting examples were the Whitehaven coal mine at Maules Creek in the Laird Forest. Now, of course, they were allowed to clear endangered boxgum woodland, endangered for a reason, not much of it left, on the proviso that they'd protect the same woodland elsewhere. Unfortunately for them and for that endangered woodland, the offset area was 95% a completely different ecosystem. Now, the Environment Department investigated that, and rightly so, because in my view it was in fact misleading information that had been provided in order to get their approval. And through a series of events that continue to perplex me, they've now dropped the investigation, despite several reports that show, yes, indeed, it was the wrong ecosystem and they had misdescribed it. So that was but one example showing that, in fact, the notion that you can offset something that is endangered and do it with something that's entirely a different ecosystem and get away with it is one that required examination. Now, the other example, of course, is the Abbott Point coal terminal dredging and offshore dumping of that dredge spoil application, which was also approved, as everything is under these apparent environment laws. And that was where internal documents from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority found that the damage was going to be so great it would be irreversible and it would be impossible to offset. That was the internal science from the Marine Park Authority, and yet the offsets have been granted anyway, and somehow the dumping of 5 million cubic metres of sludge is going to make the water quality 150% better, which of course is a notion that sounds a bit strange, and it is indeed completely impossible to achieve, a point that the World Heritage Committee made a few days ago. The third most confronting example in recent times has been the approval of one Mr Palmer's Waratah coal mine in the Galilee Basin, which is located on top of the Bimblebox Nature Refuge, the last remaining remnant vegetation in the Galilee Basin, 8,000 hectares of pristine habitat, half of which Mr Palmer wants to turn into an open-cut coal mine, and the other half he's going to longwall mine and, of course, leaving it susceptible to subsidence. Now, he said he'll protect the same vegetation elsewhere. Bit of a problem. There is no other vegetation elsewhere, so one wonders why that condition was even granted in the first place. And so it's no surprise that he hasn't been able to find an area to protect as a compensation. And to add insult to injury, if he was able to find some compensatable habitat, there is no land tenure that would protect that land from being mined in future, unless, of course, it's turned into a national park, which I'm sure Premier Campbell-Newman will have not a bar of. So these were some of the examples that led us to seek the Senate's approval to inquire into these issues. And sadly, we heard a litany of really concerning problems, not just with the implementation of environmental offsets, but also with the very notion itself. We heard evidence that there was a widespread view amongst community and environment groups that offsets were not being used as a last resort. They're meant to be under the policy, but that in fact they were very quickly resorted to. They were in fact a first choice rather than a last resort, which is the reason that I say they're used as a smokescreen for continued approvals. There is no will to refuse development applications. We've had 10 refusals in 14 years. The other points that were made are that there are no no-go zones for offsets. Apparently everything is replaceable. There's nothing that is so precious and so unique that we simply should retain it. Now, I beg to differ with that concept. That's what our environmental offsets policy says, but I think World Heritage is irreplaceable. I think critically endangered ecosystems are irreplaceable, and I think critically endangered species are irreplaceable. In fact, I think nature's irreplaceable, but particularly in those examples. So the notion that anything goes and that there's nothing off limits was a strong recommendation of the report that said that needs to be re-examined, and we certainly support that. The other flaw that was identified and came to light through the course of the hearings is that the offsets aren't often identified until years after the damage has been done. So one would think that in order to get your approval, you need to actually show that you found an offset area that's suitable. Well, no, that's not the case. Actually, you can get your approval, and often you're given years to find somewhere that's suitable. Now, what happens if you can't find that place? Well, tough luck, because you've already been allowed to clear the vegetation on the site, and once again, the environment just loses out. The report also found that there was no register of offset areas. Now, this had a number of problems. It means, of course, there's no transparency, and the public can't see whether those areas are still protected, are being properly managed, are delivering on the gains that they were promised to make. But secondly, it means that they can be double offset, because no one's noting down somewhere that they're an offset for this damage, and so you might have one offset area that's in fact meant to be compensating for 5 different areas to be damaged, because no one's actually tracking that, which seems to me a ridiculous oversight. That also means that when an offset area itself, that's meant to be protected in perpetuity under the offsets policy, is then sought to be destroyed years down the track, well, it can be, because it's not on anybody's register saying that actually no, that's meant to be off limits. So again, the notion that offsets themselves are able to be offset makes a mockery of this so-called principle that they're meant to be protected in perpetuity. The report also addressed the fact that money can be made as a substitute for protecting a different area. Now, of course, our Environment Department is understarved of funds. It's starved of staff, it's starved of funds, it's under-resourced. However, the notion that you can buy your way out of the rules that are there to protect the environment is one that I find shocking, and is one that I believe is frequently abused. I don't think you should make money an option for an offset, because you simply can't replace some of this irreplaceable ecosystems with dollars, and money will never be a substitute for that. Now, we sadly heard that there was also no monitoring of the conditions, so there was no monitoring, and the ANAO found this in the report last week as well, that the department's so understaffed they can't do proper compliance monitoring, including of conditions about offsets. So we found that no one was going back to check, well, did they find that area that they were meant to find? Is it the right sort of ecosystem that they were meant to be protecting? Are they managing it properly? Are there any funds? If the company goes belly up, is anybody else going to be able to manage it? And is it in fact delivering the environmental gains that substitute for the damage that was done at the original site? Nobody's checking any of those things. So it boiled down to the conclusion that there is no evidence whether environmental offsets are working. Nobody's keeping track. There's all of these assumptions made that nobody bothers anyone to comply with, and so we simply don't know, which again leads the Greens to conclude that they are a smokescreen and a fig leaf for just continued approvals. They're greenwash, trying to make it look like the Environment Minister gives a damn, when in fact it's just approval after approval that's been issued. So in our minority report, we included some strong recommendations that I urge both sides of the chamber to consider. We said that the government must refuse projects which have unacceptable impacts on matters of national environmental significance, because these are not insignificant areas. These are matters of national environmental significance. We should actually get some refusals where that damage is going to be done, rather than just this smokescreen and fig leaf of continued approvals with offsets. We recommended that the government immediately revoke the approval for the Maules Creek coal mine. And not only that they prosecute Whitehaven Coal for false or misleading information in the course of seeking their environment approval. They will, of course, have to reopen their criminal investigation to do that, and I'll be taking that up with the Minister. We recommended that they immediately revoke the approval for Waratah Coal's Galilee Coal project, which would eat up Bimblebox Nature Refuge, and likewise that the Abbott Point dumping and dredging approval be revoked. And finally, that any existing offset areas that have already been set in stone are actually protected into the future. But fundamentally, offsets are a joke, they're abused, there's no fixing them, they should be abandoned, and we need some refusals.